It was a quiet Sunday morning when the sun shone down on the small, peaceful town. The air was crisp, with a gentle breeze sweeping through the streets. People were making their way to church, talking and laughing as they walked. It seemed like any other day, a day for peace, for worship, and for connection. But hidden in the shadows, a threat was slowly taking shape, one that no one could see coming. A group of men, their faces hidden behind masks, were gathering in a dark alley just outside the town. These were not ordinary men. They had been driven by hatred, believing they were better than others because of the color of their skin. And today, they planned to make their message known. Today, they were going to send a warning to anyone who dared to defy their beliefs. The leader of the group, a tall man with a gruff voice, looked out over his followers with a sense of pride. He believed in fear, and today, he would make sure everyone in the town felt it. "We'll show them," he muttered to his men. "This is our town, and they don't belong here." As they walked toward the local black church, where people were gathering for their weekly service, the gang members exchanged quiet whispers. Their mission was clear: to scare the churchgoers, to remind them that their place in this town was unwanted. The gang thought they could walk in, make a scene, and leave without facing any resistance. They underestimated what lay inside that church. Inside, the atmosphere was calm, a stark contrast to the menacing shadows lurking just outside. The church was filled with the voices of people singing hymns, their voices rising in harmony, filling the room with a sense of warmth and unity. The pastor stood at the front, his hands lifted as he spoke words of encouragement and hope. No one knew the danger that was approaching them. Among the crowd sat a man who seemed to blend into the background. He wasn't dressed in anything special, just a plain shirt and jeans. He was an older man, his face weathered by years of experience, his eyes sharp and observant. He sat quietly in the pew, listening to the pastor's words, but his mind was somewhere else, somewhere far away. This man was not who he appeared to be. He had been through more in his life than anyone could guess. A former Army Ranger, he had seen the darkest parts of the world, had faced battles that no one should ever have to endure. Now he lived a quieter life, trying to put the past behind him. But some skills, the kind of skills he had learned in the military, never fade. The ability to sense danger, to react in an instant, was still sharp within him. As he listened to the peaceful music and the sermon, his instincts were alive, sensing something wasn't right. He felt a shift in the air, a tension that no one else seemed to notice. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He glanced toward the door of the church, where he saw the faintest movement outside. His military training kicked in. His eyes narrowed, scanning the area outside for any signs of danger. The Army Ranger knew something was coming. He had been trained to notice the smallest of details, and today he could feel the unease building. He had sworn to protect those around him, and he wasn't going to let anything happen to this peaceful community. Outside, the gang was moving closer. They were so focused on their mission, so sure of themselves, that they never once thought they were walking into the presence of a man who could easily take them down. But the Army Ranger didn't want violence. He never had. He simply wanted to live in peace, to let others live in peace. But if it came to protecting the people in that church, he would not hesitate. The sound of footsteps grew louder as the gang neared the church. The leader grinned beneath his mask, already imagining the chaos he was about to cause. He had no idea that the peaceful church he was about to invade held the most dangerous man he would ever meet. The Army Ranger sat quietly in the pew, his mind far away from the church service happening around him. His eyes were focused on the pastor at the front, but his thoughts drifted back to a time when he was much younger, a time when his life had been full of action and danger. It wasn't always like this. Once, he had been in the thick of it, far from the peaceful streets of this small town. He had worn a uniform, carried weapons, and worked with a team that trusted him to keep them safe. As an Army Ranger, he had been trained to handle any situation. He knew how to fight, how to think quickly, and how to survive in the most difficult environments. The years in the army had shaped him into a man who didn't fear danger. He had faced it head-on, over and over again. Whether it was in the deserts of far-off lands or the dense jungles, he had always known how to protect himself and others. But now, all of that seemed so far behind him. Now he was just another face in the crowd, trying to live a normal life. Since retiring from the army, the Ranger had made his home in this quiet town, hoping for a fresh start. He had hoped that the days of fighting were behind him, that he could find peace in the small things, a warm cup of coffee, a quiet walk through the park, a friendly chat with a neighbor. But even here, in the safety of the town, he couldn't escape the lessons from his past. He had learned a long time ago that peace wasn't always easy to keep. There were people who didn't understand what it took to protect that peace, who would try to destroy it without a second thought. He had made his decision to leave the violence of the military, to start a new life. But deep down, he knew that if trouble ever came knocking, he couldn't just turn away. As he sat there, listening to the pastor's words about kindness and understanding, the Ranger's thoughts wandered to what had brought him here in the first place. After years of fighting, of being surrounded by enemies, he had longed for a sense of community, for the kind of bond that came from people helping each other. The church had seemed like a good place to start. Here, he could finally experience something different, a chance to find some peace in a world that sometimes seemed full of chaos. But peace, he knew, was fragile. And today, as he sat quietly among the congregation, he could feel something shifting in the air. It wasn't a feeling of peace. It was the opposite. There was a subtle tension, like a storm was brewing on the horizon. It was a feeling he had known all too well in the past. His body, trained to recognize danger, was telling him that something wasn't right. His eyes flicked toward the door of the church. The sound of footsteps outside was faint, but there was something about it that caught his attention. He could hear the rhythm of the steps, the way they didn't match the usual sounds of people coming and going. This was different, and he couldn't ignore it. The Ranger's hand instinctively moved to the inside pocket of his jacket, where he kept a small knife. It wasn't for any violent purpose, but old habits die hard. He always kept something on him, just in case. He had learned never to be caught off guard, and today seemed like one of those days when being unprepared could mean the difference between safety and danger. He didn't want to believe that trouble was coming. He didn't want to think about using his skills again, not after all these years. But his instincts were sharper than ever. He had learned to trust them, and right now, they were telling him that something bad was about to happen. In the past, he had been part of a team, always working with others to face threats head-on. But now he was alone. There was no one else to watch his back. If something went wrong, it was up to him and him alone to make sure the people around him were safe. The Ranger took a slow breath, trying to calm his racing thoughts. He didn't want to act without knowing what was happening, but his training was telling him to stay alert. He glanced around the room, taking in the faces of the churchgoers. They were all so unaware, so trusting of the peaceful environment they had built. It made him want to protect them even more. Inside the church, the atmosphere was warm and welcoming. The sound of singing filled the air, and the soft melody of the choir made the building feel like a safe haven from the world outside. People of all ages were gathered together, their voices rising in unison as they sang hymns that spoke of hope, faith, and unity. The sense of peace in the church was so strong that it seemed impossible for anything to disturb it. At the front of the room, the pastor smiled as he looked out over the congregation. His face was full of kindness, and his voice was soothing as he spoke words of encouragement. Today's sermon was about the power of community, about how people could come together to support one another in times of need. He spoke of the strength that came from unity, of how each person played a role in making the world a better place. As the pastor spoke, the people in the pews listened intently. There was an older woman sitting near the front, her eyes closed as she swayed gently to the music. She had been coming to this church for years, and her faith was unwavering. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she whispered a prayer under her breath. She was thankful for the church and for the community it provided, a place where she could find peace in a world that often felt uncertain. Next to her sat a young couple, holding hands as they listened to the pastor's words. They had just moved to the town a few months ago, and the church had become their second home. They had quickly found a sense of belonging here, and they were grateful to be part of a community that cared for one another. They had met many kind people, and the church was a place where they could make new friends and find comfort. In the back row, a teenage boy sat with his parents. He was quiet, his head slightly down, but his eyes were alert. He had been coming to church with his family for years, but today, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was a strange sensation, one he couldn't explain. His mind kept wandering, and he found it difficult to focus on the pastor's words. There was an unease in the air that he couldn't quite place. The young boy wasn't the only one who felt this way. Across the room, an older man, a regular member of the church, had the same sense of discomfort. He had been in this building countless times, but today something felt different. He couldn't explain it, but there was a tension in the air, something that didn't belong in this peaceful space. He glanced around, trying to read the faces of those around him. But everyone seemed calm and unaware. Perhaps it was just his imagination, he thought. Despite the unease that lingered in the back of their minds, the people of the church continued to worship, trusting that the safety and love they had found here would keep them protected. The sense of community was strong, and the bond between them all was clear. This was a place where everyone was welcome, regardless of their past or their struggles. In the church, people could find comfort and support, knowing that they weren't alone in the world. The Army Ranger, still sitting quietly in his pew, observed the churchgoers. He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of respect for the way the people in the church cared for one another. He had spent much of his life surrounded by the chaos of war, where every day was a battle for survival. But here, in this church, he saw something different. A community built on trust, love, and faith. For the Ranger, this was the peace he had always wanted. It was a peaceful life, one where people supported each other without question. It reminded him of the camaraderie he had felt with his fellow soldiers, the way they had worked together to survive in the harshest of conditions. But this peace was different. It was gentle, it was kind, and it was something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Outside the church, the atmosphere had changed. The sounds of the birds chirping and the rustling of leaves in the trees now felt far away. A group of men, moving in silence, stood in the shadows, their footsteps heavy and deliberate. They were no longer just ordinary people walking down the street. They were on a mission, one they believed was justified by their own twisted sense of superiority. The leader of the group, a tall man with a deep voice, scanned the church from across the street. His eyes narrowed as he looked at the building. His mind focused on the message he was determined to send. He believed his actions would make a statement, that his presence would make others see things his way. But what he didn't know was that inside, there was someone far more capable than he could ever imagine. "Let's go," he said to the others, his tone firm, but with an edge of excitement. He was ready to carry out the plan, and he believed there was nothing that could stop him. His group followed, a mix of anger and hatred simmering beneath their masks. They had come here to remind the town of who they believed was in charge, and they were sure no one would dare to stop them. As they walked closer to the church, the leader could feel his pulse quicken. This was it, the moment when everyone would see what happened when people didn't know their place. He was certain that once they made their presence known, the people inside would shrink back in fear, would listen to the message of dominance they were about to send. He didn't see anyone who could stand in their way. The Ranger, sitting still in the church, was far from unaware of the approaching danger. His senses had been sharp the moment the gang entered the street. He could hear the faint sound of footsteps growing louder with each passing second, and he knew that whatever was coming, it wasn't good. His hand once again hovered near his jacket, where he kept his small knife, but he didn't want to escalate things unless absolutely necessary. Inside the church, people continued to sing and listen to the pastor, unaware of the men approaching outside. The calmness of the church stood in stark contrast to the chaos that was brewing just outside its walls. The people were lost in the peaceful moments of their faith, their minds focused on the sermon, their hearts lifted by the music. It was hard to imagine that anything could disturb this sanctuary. But the ranger knew better. He had learned to trust his instincts. After years of serving in the army, he could sense when something was off, and everything about this moment felt wrong. He looked over the faces of the congregation, seeing the joy and warmth in their eyes. He had seen what destruction looked like before, and he would not let it reach this place. Not today. The gang had now made their way up to the church steps. The leader looked back at his group, giving them a nod. It was time. They moved into position, preparing to carry out their plan. The leader, filled with confidence, reached for the door of the church. He thought the people inside would cower, that they would be too frightened to respond. But what he didn't know was that there was one person inside who wasn't afraid. The Army Ranger stood, his mind already working through his plan. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he was prepared to stop the threat. He could already hear the faint creak of the church doors opening. The gang was too close now. There wasn't much time. He glanced toward the exit, his eyes calculating the best course of action. If he could take care of the gang outside quickly and quietly, no one would have to know what had happened. The church would stay safe, and the people would remain unaware of the danger that had been right at their doorstep. But even as he formulated his plan, a part of him hoped that this was all just a mistake, that the gang would turn away and leave, that there wouldn't be any need for action. He wanted to believe that peace could remain untouched. But in his heart, he knew better. The world wasn't always as peaceful as it seemed. Sometimes, even the quietest places had to be protected. The door to the church creaked open slowly, almost as if it sensed the tension in the air. The sound seemed louder than usual, and for a moment, everything inside the church went silent. The ranger's heart beat faster, and his senses sharpened. He didn't want things to escalate, but he knew the gang wasn't here to talk. They had made up their minds, and it was up to him to stop them before things went too far. Inside the church, no one seemed to notice the change in atmosphere. People were still seated, still listening to the pastor, still singing, their voices filling the room. The sense of peace that had once filled the space was still present, but now there was an edge to it. The ranger's eyes flicked to the door, waiting for the first sign of movement. The gang was just outside, their feet heavy against the steps as they made their way toward the entrance. The leader stood in front, his hand on the door, ready to push it open. He looked back at his followers, who stood close behind him, eager to carry out their plan. They were confident, believing the churchgoers would be frightened and helpless. They had no idea what was about to happen. The ranger moved silently, his footsteps barely making the sound. He could hear the faint voices from the front of the church, but his focus was entirely on the door. The gang was so close now, and he had no choice but to act. He had trained for moments like this, when everything depended on his ability to stay calm and make the right choice in an instant. He waited. Then, the door began to open, and the leader stepped inside. The first thing he saw was the calm, peaceful faces of the congregation, sitting quietly in their seats. But as his eyes scanned the room, they quickly shifted toward the ranger, who had silently positioned himself near the back of the church. The Army Ranger was no longer just a man in the crowd. He was a force to be reckoned with. His calm demeanor and sharp eyes immediately told the leader that this was not going to be as easy as they had thought. The leader hesitated, his hand still gripping the door, unsure of what to do next. He had expected fear. He had expected people to panic and scatter, to run from the danger he and his gang brought with them. But instead, he found a calm, focused man staring him down, as if daring him to make a move. The ranger didn't flinch. He stood still, but his body was ready. He wasn't sure what the gang's intentions were yet, but he knew he couldn't let them cause harm. They were too close, and the situation was too dangerous. He had to act fast, before anyone else got hurt. The leader took a step forward, his eyes narrowing as he sized up the ranger. "What's this?" he muttered, his voice low but filled with arrogance. "You think you can stop us?" The ranger didn't answer. He didn't need to. His actions would speak louder than any words ever could. The gang members behind the leader seemed to shift nervously. They weren't used to being challenged, especially in a place like this. They had expected to be the ones in control, to be the ones who scared everyone into submission. But the presence of the Army Ranger had thrown them off balance. They could feel the difference in the air, the quiet tension that suggested the situation was already slipping out of their hands. Still, the leader was determined. He took another step forward, his voice rising slightly. "We're here to make a point," he said, as though his words would suddenly make the situation clear. "Get out of our way." The ranger didn't move. He didn't say a word. He simply watched, calculating his next move. He wasn't afraid, but he knew that words alone wouldn't stop these men. It would take action, swift and deliberate, to keep the people inside safe. As the leader took another step, the ranger made his decision. He wasn't going to let them continue. He knew that if he didn't act now, the situation could quickly spiral out of control. The people in the church were vulnerable, and he couldn't let them become part of the gang's twisted plans. The leader of the gang took another step toward the ranger. His eyes narrowed, waiting for the next move. The tension in the church was thick, like a storm about to break. Everyone inside could feel that something was wrong, but they didn't know what was happening. They could see the serious expressions on the ranger's face and the tense way the gang members stood at the door. No one was moving, but everyone was holding their breath. The ranger stayed still, his gaze locked on the leader. He didn't want to fight. He didn't want to hurt anyone. But he knew that if he didn't act now, the situation could turn dangerous. He had trained for years to deal with high-stress situations, and now every skill he had learned was coming to the surface. He couldn't let these men destroy the peace that had filled the church only moments before. The leader of the gang raised his hand, motioning for his followers to move forward. They started to step into the church, one by one. The ranger's mind raced. He knew the moment they crossed the threshold, things would escalate. But he wasn't going to let them get any further. This was his time to act. With one swift move, the ranger sprang into action. He stepped forward, his body a blur of controlled strength. He blocked the doorway, standing firm like a wall. He wasn't aggressive, but his presence was powerful. The gang members stopped in their tracks, unsure of what to do. They weren't expecting anyone to challenge them. They had expected fear, but instead, they found someone who wasn't afraid. "Leave," the ranger said, his voice steady but firm. It wasn't a command. It was a warning. He wasn't going to allow anyone to disturb the peace inside the church. But the gang wasn't ready to back down. They had come too far to just turn away. They had come with one goal in mind, and they believed nothing would stop them. The leader of the gang sneered. "You can't stop us," he muttered, trying to make himself sound confident. But even as he spoke, there was doubt in his eyes. He hadn't expected the ranger to stand in his way. The leader took a step closer, but the ranger remained unmoving, blocking the doorway. The tension was thick, and everyone inside the church could feel it. For a brief moment, everything was silent. The gang members exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how to respond. They had come here thinking they were in control, but now they didn't know what to do. They had never faced someone like the ranger, someone who stood their ground without hesitation. Then, without warning, the leader made a move. He stepped forward again, this time with more confidence, but the ranger was quicker. In one fluid motion, he blocked the leader's path once more, his body positioned in a way that prevented the man from moving any further. The leader looked furious, but the ranger stayed calm, his focus unwavering. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He wasn't here to fight. He simply wanted to protect the people inside the church. The leader, now realizing that the ranger wasn't going to back down, took a deep breath. He knew that he couldn't push any further without risking a bigger problem. "Turn around," the ranger said again, his voice calm but resolute. "This is not your fight. There's no need for this." The gang members shifted uneasily. They had never faced someone who spoke with such authority, who stood so firmly against them. The quiet strength in the ranger's voice was enough to make them hesitate, to question their actions, but the leader wasn't ready to give up. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to turn back. The air between them crackled with tension. The gang members were now unsure of how to proceed. They had expected to walk in, make their point, and leave. But the ranger had changed everything. He wasn't just a man standing in their way. He was a force they couldn't control. Inside the church, the congregation had fallen silent. They could see what was happening, but no one dared to move. Everyone was holding their breath, hoping the situation would resolve without further trouble. The ranger's presence was the only thing standing between them and the gang that had threatened their peace. The tension in the church was palpable. The gang members stood still, their eyes flickering between the army ranger and each other, unsure of what to do next. They had thought they would come here, make a statement, and leave without any trouble. But now, standing face to face with a man who wasn't afraid of them, they were starting to realize this wasn't going to be as easy as they had imagined. The leader of the group, frustrated and unsure, paced back and forth. He had always been the one in control, the one who made the decisions, but now his authority felt shaky. He couldn't figure out why the ranger wasn't backing down. Every move he made seemed calculated, calm, and strong, completely different from the fear he had expected. The leader felt his confidence slipping away, and with it, the entire purpose of the gang's mission. Inside the church, the congregation remained quiet, watching the scene unfold. They had no idea what was going to happen next, but they could sense the shift in the air. What had once been a peaceful Sunday service was now filled with uncertainty. The calm atmosphere had been replaced with tension, and everyone held their breath, hoping the situation would end without any harm. The army ranger, still standing in the doorway, didn't make a move. He wasn't going to escalate things. His goal wasn't to start a fight. It was to protect those around him. But he also knew that sometimes a single moment could change everything. The way the gang was acting, the way they hesitated, told him they were beginning to realize they weren't in control anymore. The leader stopped pacing and looked the ranger in the eyes. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, sizing each other up. The gang leader opened his mouth, as though preparing to say something, but the words didn't come. He hesitated, and that brief pause was enough. He was starting to feel the weight of the situation, the uncomfortable feeling of being unsure, of not knowing if his plan would work. The ranger spoke softly but firmly, his voice steady. "You don't have to do this," he said, his words cutting through the silence. "This isn't the way to make your point. Whatever you came here for, there's a better way." The leader blinked, the harshness in his eyes slowly softening as he considered the ranger's words. It wasn't the kind of response he had expected. He had thought the ranger would give in, that he would be afraid, that he would leave the people in the church to fend for themselves. But the ranger hadn't moved, hadn't wavered. He stood strong, his calm presence a stark contrast to the gang's tension. For a moment, the leader faltered. The power he had thought he would hold in this situation felt like it was slipping through his fingers. The man in front of him wasn't reacting the way he expected. The calm confidence in the ranger's demeanor made him question whether this was the right path. One of the other gang members, a younger man, shifted uncomfortably. He looked around at his friends, then back at the ranger. His hand twitched, as if wanting to step forward, but the hesitation in his eyes was clear. The gang was falling apart at the seams. They weren't unified anymore. There was doubt now, and that doubt was powerful. It was enough to make even the bravest person second-guess their actions. The leader turned to his gang, his eyes flickering between them. He could see the uncertainty in their faces, the shift in their stance. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. They weren't here to discuss, to talk. They were here to make a statement. But now, that statement seemed unclear. The quiet man standing in their way wasn't afraid. The people in the church weren't afraid. And that made the leader uneasy. Maybe this was a mistake, the leader muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. The words hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. His voice lacked the confidence it had earlier. There was a flicker of doubt in his eyes that hadn't been there before. The ranger didn't say anything. He simply stood, unwavering, waiting. His presence alone was enough to make the gang leader rethink his decisions. The gang members shifted uneasily, glancing at each other. The silence stretched out, the tension hanging like a thick fog. But it wasn't the ranger who broke the silence. It was the leader, who finally took a deep breath and motioned for his group to step back. The gang, though hesitant, followed his lead. One by one, they stepped away from the doorway, their eyes lingering on the ranger as they backed up. There was no fight, no battle, just a quiet retreat. The ranger didn't move, but his stance relaxed just slightly, the tension in his body easing. The battle hadn't been won with fists or weapons. It had been won with calm strength, with the power of standing firm in the face of intimidation. And in that moment, the ranger had proven that sometimes peace could be achieved without a single swing. As the gang slowly retreated from the church, the ranger stood still, watching them go. His eyes were calm, but his mind raced with thoughts of what could have happened. He knew that even though the danger had passed, it didn't mean the threat was truly gone. Sometimes, people like that didn't give up easily. But for now, the church was safe, and that was all that mattered. Inside the church, the congregation had been holding their breath, unsure of what would happen next. As the last of the gang members left, there was a moment of silence before the pastor spoke. His voice, though soft, was filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said simply, looking toward the Army Ranger. "You've protected us today. You've given us a chance to be safe." The ranger nodded quietly, his gaze scanning the faces of the churchgoers. There were no words for this kind of gratitude, no way to express how deeply the ranger appreciated their peaceful resolve. He hadn't come here to be thanked, and he didn't expect praise. He had simply done what needed to be done, the same way he had always done in his military days. But something about today felt different. The people here didn't just need protection. They needed hope, and he had given them that. The ranger took a deep breath, as if to steady himself, and began walking toward the back of the church. He hadn't come for recognition, and he didn't want to stay in the spotlight any longer than necessary. He had done what he had to do, and now it was time to leave. But as he walked, he heard footsteps behind him. It was the pastor, who had followed him quietly, catching up just before the ranger reached the door. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" the pastor asked, his voice gentle but persistent. The ranger paused, glancing over his shoulder. He had expected this. People often wanted to express their thanks, to offer their gratitude after a moment like this. But the ranger wasn't sure he was ready for any more attention. "I just wanted to say that you've done something incredible today," the pastor continued. "Not just in protecting us, but in showing us that peace is possible. That one person can make a difference when they stand their ground. And that even when faced with fear, there is strength in remaining calm." The ranger didn't say anything at first. He wasn't sure how to respond. He had been trained to follow orders, to do his job, and move on. But this time, something inside him felt different. He had protected these people, yes, but they had also given him something in return, something he hadn't realized he needed. They had shown him that peace, even in a world full of uncertainty, was possible. "I just did what anyone would do," the ranger said quietly. "I wasn't looking for anything in return." The pastor smiled softly, his eyes filled with understanding. "Not everyone has the strength to act when it's needed most, but you did. And because of that, You've given us something more valuable than protection. You've given us hope." The ranger stood there for a moment, considering the pastor's words. He had never thought of himself as a symbol of hope. He had always been a soldier, a protector, nothing more. But today in this church, in this community, he had seen something he hadn't seen in a long time. The power of unity and the strength that comes from standing together. "I'm just one man," the ranger said, his voice a little softer now. "I don't know if I can make a difference, but I can do my part." The pastor nodded. Sometimes that's all it takes. One person doing their part, and the rest follows. The ranger turned to leave, but before he stepped out the door, he paused. He looked back at the people gathered in the church, the faces of those he had protected. They were all standing tall now, their fear replaced by a quiet sense of strength. The threat was over, but something within them had changed. They had been given a gift today, a gift that went beyond just being safe. It was the gift of knowing that peace could be fought for, that it could be defended. He stepped out into the sunlight, the warmth of the day on his face. It felt different, somehow more comforting than it had before. He had done his part. The church was safe, and the people inside would go on living their lives, stronger for what had happened. The ranger knew that he didn't need any thanks. He didn't need to be recognized. Today, he had done what was necessary. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace inside himself, knowing that he had protected something worth fighting for. As he walked away from the church, his steps were steady, his purpose clear. The past might never leave him, but today he had found a new kind of peace, one that came from standing up for what was right and protecting those who needed it most. And that was enough.